Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dig into a fascinating period, Fidel Castro's Cuba. We've got this really interesting study of his economic policies, and we'll be looking at the good, the bad, and how it all ties into his decades in power.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period for sure. The Cuban Revolution, it gives us this incredible look into how radical social change plays out, the possibilities, the potential problems. And it shows how economics, even with powerful regimes, economics always have an impact.
Okay, so we're starting in the 1950s in Cuba. Imagine extreme inequality, American corporations with a ton of influence, and then, bam, revolution. Enter Fidel Castro.
And one of the most important things to grasp about Castro's early moves, especially that massive land reform in 1959, is that it wasn't just about ideology, This was strategic. It was about shaking up the existing power structures and shoring up his own support base, which was essential if he was going to stay in charge.
So he's playing the long game here, securing his position while making these huge changes. What did that even look like practically? Did people wake up one morning and find their land redistributed?
Basically, yeah. Castro targeted these big land holdings. A lot of them were owned by wealthy Cubans or American corporations. And he redistributed that land, often as cooperative farms. It had a huge impact, especially in rural communities who'd been marginalized for decades. But it also set the stage for the U.S. embargo that would have a pretty huge impact on Cuba's future, economically speaking.
That's right, nationalization. I know it's a key part of socialist economies, but can you talk a bit about how it played out in Cuba? What was the impact?
Sure. Throughout the 1960s, Castro nationalized everything, sugar plantations, which were a huge part of their economy, to even small businesses, restaurants, shops, you name it.
Yeah.
The idea was to bring all of that under state control, in theory, to make things more equitable and distribute wealth more evenly.
Sounds like that would take massive government organization. Was that even achievable? How did it actually work?
You're right. It took a huge amount of central planning. And that's where we see both the good and the bad of this approach. On the one hand, literacy rates improved, healthcare improved. But on the other, you had economic stagnation, shortages, and you basically stifle individual innovation. It really shows that tension between equality and economic growth.
Yeah, classic good intentions, unintended consequences. Speaking of unintended consequences, our sources mention this thing called the 10 million ton sugar shock. What was that all about?
That was a big moment for Castro's economic policy. In 1970, he decides to go all in on sugar.
Why sugar?
Well, at the time, sugar was Cuba's main export. It was how they made money.
Yeah.
Castro believed that if they could ramp up production, I'm talking 10 million tons, they could supercharge the Cuban economy. So this massive mobilization of resources, labor, everything's directed toward this one goal.
Wow, the entire country was focused on sugar production.
Absolutely. All hands on deck. But, and this is key, there was a miscalculation. They only managed to produce about 8.5 million tons. And that shortfall, well, that had some pretty serious consequences.
I can imagine. What were the ramifications of missing that target?
Well, it was a blow to the regime's credibility, for one. It really underscored the risks of central planning, of putting all your eggs in one basket, even if that basket is full of sugar. It led to hardship and just highlighted the challenges of managing a national economy in such a centralized way.
It makes you wonder how Castro managed to weather those economic storms and stay in power for so long.
Well, that's where Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union comes into play, but we'll get into that more after a quick break. So after the revolution, the Soviet Union, they became Cuba's main benefactor, economically speaking. The Soviets gave them a ton of aid, bought their sugar at inflated prices, and supplied them with cheap oil, which, for a developing nation, oil is essential.
So it really gave Castro's government some breathing room, especially with the economic problem we've been talking about.
Exactly. It allowed him to keep those social programs going, which, despite the economic problems, were getting some impressive results. We're talking increased life expectancy, way lower infant mortality rates, literacy rates were up there with developed nations.
It's wild how this period is so complicated. The country's facing all this economic hardship, but then they're making these big strides in education, healthcare. It really makes you think about how to evaluate Castro's time in charge.
It does. And to really get it, I think it helps to look at how different historians view his economic policies.
Right, like the traditionalists and revisionists from the source material, right? It reminds me of how sometimes reading about history, it's like looking at something from every angle, not just head on.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And yeah, those different historical lenses, they give us a much clearer picture. So the traditionalists, they tend to focus on how Castro consolidated power and the long-term economic impact of things like nationalization.
So they put more emphasis on the downsides we talked about. Stagnation, shortages, all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. They argue that these policies, even if they were well-intentioned, they ended up stifling Cuba's economic potential. And that led to the dependence on the Soviet Union, which would become a big problem later. And they also point out the suppression of dissent, the lack of democratic freedoms under Castro.
Right, but we also have the revisionists. They seem to have a more, I don't know, a more nuanced view. How do they see Castro's economic policy?
Well, revisionists, they get the economic challenges, but they really focus on the social progress under Castro. Like the improvements to healthcare and education we talked about. They'd say you can't analyze Cuba's economy and just ignore the U.S. embargo. That embargo really limited their ability to trade with other countries.
So the revisionists think those external factors played a much bigger role than maybe the traditionalists would argue.
Exactly. They emphasize the progress in social justice, especially for Afro-Cubans, who, before the revolution, had faced a lot of discrimination. They highlight how, for the first time, Castro's policies gave them access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities that they'd been denied before.
It's amazing how these two perspectives can look at the same event so differently. It seems like understanding the context, both within Cuba and internationally, is really important.
Absolutely. And there's more. Our sources also talk about the Marxist perspective, which, no surprise, sees Castro as fighting against capitalist imperialism. They argue that his economic policies, even the ones that some might call inefficient, were necessary to break free from capitalist exploitation.
So for Marxists, those economic struggles were just part of a much bigger ideological battle.
Precisely. Now, in contrast to those, we have what we call the consensus or orthodox view. They try to find a middle ground.
So they see both the positives and the negatives, the social progress, the economic problems, all of it.
Exactly. They recognize the achievements in healthcare, education, social equality, for sure. But they also emphasize that those achievements, they weren't always sustainable because the economic foundation was shaky. They point to the special period, which we'll discuss in a bit, as evidence of that.
So they're saying those improvements, while great, came at a cost that couldn't be ignored forever.
Right. And then there are the structuralists. They're more interested in how Cuba's government actually functioned, whether it could manage a centrally planned economy effectively.
They focus more on the actual mechanics of governing. Did they find any structural issues?
Well, they argue that bureaucratic inefficiencies, the lack of market incentives, just the difficulty of planning a complex economy from the top down, all of that led to a lot of the economic issues Cuba faced. For example, they'd say the 10 million ton sugar shock. That shows how a well-intentioned plan can still go wrong because of those limitations. They believe that giving more autonomy to local businesses, to individuals, might have led to more sustainable results.
It's amazing how each perspective gives you a totally different way to look at this time period. It's not about finding one right answer. It's about getting all these different views to really understand Castro's Cuba.
Exactly. You have to engage with multiple viewpoints when you're analyzing history. Acknowledge the accomplishments and the shortcomings.
It's so important to look at these historical periods with nuance to avoid those simplistic good versus bad narratives. Speaking of nuance, we mentioned the special period earlier. Can you explain what that was and how it affected Cuba?
The special period, well, it was a really tough time for Cuba. The Soviet Union collapsed in '91, and that had a huge impact.
How so? Why was the Soviet Union so important for Cuba?
Well, see, up to that point, Cuba depended a lot on Soviet aid and trade.
Like their economic safety net.
Exactly, their lifeline. And then, poof, gone. It left Cuba in a really tough spot economically. Castro had to figure out, okay, what now? His centrally planned economy, it wasn't working anymore, and he had to make some changes.
Wow. So what happened? How did Cuba deal with that?
Austerity. They had rationing, shortages of everything, food, medicine, you name it. Living standards went way down, and people had to get really creative just to get by.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Did Castro change his economic policies at all during this time?
He did, yeah. I mean, what choice did he have? Things were really bad. So he started introducing some market-oriented reforms. Cautiously, though. Private enterprise was allowed, but only a little, mostly in tourism and agriculture. He also opened things up to some foreign investment, but again, very controlled.
That's a pretty big deal for someone who was so against capitalism, isn't it?
Yes, it was about survival at that point.
Yeah.
But Castro, he still believed in socialism. Those reforms, they were to address the immediate crisis, not to abandon his core beliefs.
It sounds like he was trying to balance his ideology with the very real needs of the country.
Yeah, exactly. The special period was brutal. There's no other way to say it. But it showed how resilient the Cuban people are. They
Okay.
adapted, they found ways to make things work. And, there were even some positive side effects. People focused more on sustainable agriculture. Pollution went down because of fuel shortages, less driving. So, even in those dark times, there were glimmers of hope.
It's interesting how even in really tough situations, there can be those unexpected upsides. It seems like the special period was a real turning point for Cuba. They had to look at their economic system in a whole new way and adapt.
It was a defining moment, for sure. It challenged everything they thought they knew about their economy, made them realize they needed to be more self-sufficient. And it showed just how complex socialism is, how hard it is to make it work. It's something people still debate today.
It really has been an eye-opening look at a complex and, frankly, fascinating period. So much happened. Looking back at Castro's Cuba with all its successes and failures, what do you think are some of the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
I think Castro's Cuba teaches us a lot about how social change works, the good and the bad. Even when you have the best intentions, things don't always go as planned. And when you're trying to create a more just society, you have to be very aware of the economic realities. It's a tough balancing act. It also shows why it's so important to look at history from different angles to get the full picture.
Absolutely. Don't accept simple answers. Always dig deeper. Well, on that note, that wraps up our deep dive into Fidel Castro's Cuba. We covered a lot of ground, the revolution, his economic policies, and how they shaped the country. As always, thank you for joining us on the deep dive and keep those questions coming.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.